This is little Albert. He is happy. The rat is not scary. This is Dr. Watson. He will bang the metal bar. Now Albert is crying. The rat is now scary. Few months pass. We put a rat in front of Albert. Albert starts crying. We put a fluffy bunny in front of Albert. He is still crying. We put a Santa Claus mask in front of Albert. He is still crying. Dr. Watson publishes a paper. In it, he tells us that fear can be conditioned. When he clangs the bar, this is an unconditioned stimulus. We do not need to be taught that loud noises are uncomfortable and make us unhappy. The unconditioned response would be to cry. A neutral stimulus now becomes a conditioned stimulus. And the conditioned response is now crying. Why am I talking about this? I am talking about this because this is probably the most famous example of fear induced through classical conditioning. With the Saavedra and Silverman study, it is important to know the classical view of phobias and how they are formed, and this is through something called behaviorism. It states that we could actually condition people to feel a certain way about certain stimuli. And there's a lot of jargon, but take some time to learn it because this is a backbone of lots of psychological studies, not just for AS, but also for A-level next year. So an unconditioned stimulus is something that you naturally have a fear of, and it will lead to an unconditioned response, which is a natural reaction. If you pair a naturally occurring undesirable stimulus with something else, they will kind of be linked together so that you will condition somebody to have a learned response, which oftentimes resembles the conditioned response. So to use an example, let's say you got bit by a dog. You don't need to be taught that being bit by a dog is a bad thing. The conditioned stimulus is now maybe all dogs. It will generalize whenever I see a dog, I will feel fear. So this case, all dogs is the conditioned stimulus. And again, the unconditioned response, which was the natural reaction, now becomes similar to the conditioned response, which is a learned reaction or response. So this is a traditional way of looking at how fears are formed. Saavedra and Silverman challenge this notion that this is the only way that we learn how to fear something. They recognize that this is part of it, but it's not the whole picture. So they published a paper to add some new ingredients to how fears are formed. The paper is a case study entitled Disgust and a Specific Phobia of Buttons. In the preamble to the study, they talk about two types of ways that phobias are learned. The first is called expectancy learning, and this conforms very easily to what we just talked about. Another way of saying this is expectancy learning is similar or the same as classical conditioning. So somebody sees a ladder, which is a neutral stimulus. He falls off the ladder. The next time he sees a ladder, he feels fear. Now the neutral stimulus is conditioned. So in other words, he expects to fall if he climbs it again. That is simple enough. What makes Saavedra and Silverman complicated is that there is a new element called evaluative learning, and this is more cognitive than behavioral. It involves thinking about the feared stimulus. So let's use the ladder example again. The person thinks, hey, what's up there? Climbs the ladder and falls. But the difference is, after he falls, he makes an interpretation of the situation that may lead to a long-lasting phobia. Ladders are icky, disgusting things. So now we have a new element, we have a cognitive element, and we have disgust now thrown into the equation. Another way of looking at this is expectancy learning kind of looks forward to future dangers, while evaluative learning sort of looks backward at something that had already happened. The key difference between the two types of learning are the last stage. Expecting a bad thing to happen, thinking about the bad thing that did already happen. So let's apply it to Saavedra and Silverman specifically. So in a class, a 5-year-old boy and his classmates are doing an art project. And to make this art project, they need to use materials like buttons. The teacher has buttons on her desk, and she says, if you need more buttons, come find them on my desk. So the boy goes up to the desk, reaches for them, but they fall on him. Okay. Now, in a classical behaviorist view, he will have expectancy learning, thinking that it will happen again if he were to reach for the bowl of buttons, developing a phobia of the buttons. But in evaluative learning, it's the same process, except after the incident happens, he retroactively applies a cognitive interpretation of the event that leads to things or thoughts like, these buttons are disgusting, or all buttons are disgusting. And again, the difference between expectancy and evaluative is the last step of these panels. The aim of the study is to look at the ignored emotion of disgust when talking about phobia. Usually when we talk about phobia, we think of an irrational fear or fear that paralyzes you and causes you to change your lifestyle. So here, the two new elements are, again, disgust and evaluative learning. So what role does disgust play in phobia development? And that is part of the aim of the study, is to investigate this in a case study. Now, case studies usually involve one or a few people, not always, but usually. And these people have a rare or special characteristic. This is not always true, so you'll see that I use the word usually or often in all of these bullet points. Case studies are often longitudinal. They're not snapshots. They take place over a longer period of time than traditional studies. The data is usually in-depth and detailed, and they are usually hard to generalize to the population at large. Some details are given in the primary source material. Tells us he's a 9-year-old boy who's Hispanic American, but when this incident happened, he was 5, so he's been living with this condition for 4 years at least. So the parent was deeply concerned, the mother, and she brought him to a therapist's office. To make sure that he indeed have a specific phobia, as detailed in the DSM, an assessment tool is used to make sure that his condition matches the recommended criteria in the DSM-IV. This study was published in 2002, and at the time of the therapy and the publication, the DSM-IV was the main diagnostic manual for mental illnesses or disorders. Nowadays, we use the DSM-V, but again, this is from the past, so we're using the DSM-IV. The assessment tool that was used was called the Anxiety Disorders Interview Schedule for the DSM Parent and Child version. So 2 separate assessments, one for the child, one for the parent. When it was satisfied that the child indeed did meet the criteria, then the therapy would start in earnest. And one step in creating a baseline for his fears is to use what's called a fear or anxiety or feelings thermometer. Usually these are referred to as anxiety hierarchies or thermometers. And they could range in anything from 0 to 100 or 0 to 10. In this case, they used a 9-level scale from 0 to 8. And they asked the boy to rate different types of buttons according to how much distress they caused. You could take some time to look at this fear rating, But please keep in mind that the smaller the buttons go, the higher on the anxiety chart they rate, which may be the opposite of what you would expect. He doesn't like small, clear, or small plastic colored buttons. Do you need to memorize this? It's a lot of work for the effort. It's maybe a little bit of payoff in memorizing this, but just know that this was done to create a baseline which they can compare his later exposures later on, or his later feelings later on. So the main tool or the main therapy they're going to use to try to rid him or to alleviate this phobia is to use something called exposure therapy. There are several types of exposure therapy, and here is an example using an arachnophobic person. So in traditional exposure therapy, you increase the intensity of the feared stimulus in stages. And this could happen over several therapy sessions. So in this example, a woman sees a picture of a spider, holds the picture, sees a toy spider, and eventually it elevates to what's called in vivo exposure. In vivo is Latin for in life. So in other words, a real spider. The main exposure therapy used initially in this study is in vivo exposure therapy. So what the therapists hope to do is to increase the exposure, moving from the least distressing to the most distressing, and hoping that over time he will acclimate to the anxiety felt and realize there is no real danger in the buttons. As the exposure went on, we are told that there was a contingency management system used, also known as a token economy, to help the person or the little boy feel comfortable around buttons by associating their exposure to positive reinforcement or reward. Now, in the original article, which is rather short, we're not told exactly what the positive reinforcement was. Was it candy? Was it toys? Was it positive praise from the mother? All we know is that the mother was the one providing the positive reinforcement. So an example of traditional positive reinforcement is something that you may have encountered in your life, where you do something good that your parents approve of, and they reward you in some tangible way. For example, I had A's on my report card, and therefore my parents bought me ice cream. A very simple explanation. But the thing is, the exposure therapy did not work too well. So they had to move to a different type of exposure therapy. The first exposure therapy, like we said, was in vivo, and there were 4 sessions of in vivo exposure. And this would be 30 minutes with the boy by himself, 20 minutes with the mother, and this is purely a behavioral approach. But as I said before, his distress ratings on the thermometer became higher rather than lower. Therefore, a behaviorist approach by itself was not going to do the job. So they moved to a more cognitive approach. They used a second type of exposure therapy, which is known as imaginal desensitization. So he would imagine things involving buttons rather than being exposed to real buttons. In these imaginal exposures, they would ask him to imagine first small buttons moving up to medium, then large buttons, and to vocalize his cognitions, to talk about how the buttons feel, or how they look, or even how they smell, which is odd because we don't associate buttons with smelling, especially smelling gross. So by working through his cognitions and addressing cognitions rather than just behaviors, we are trying to get a better handle on how he could approach buttons in the future. Again, we're not told very much of the script that was used in doing this. All we're told, essentially, is that by addressing cognitions, we're going to have more success than a purely behavioral approach. Now, this study is longitudinal, so there were 4 sessions in vivo, 7 sessions imaginal, and then there was a long-term follow-up for a year, where 6 months later, they administered the same assessment tool to see if he still fit the criteria for a specific phobia. But 6 months later, they found that the boy did indeed have a shirt on with buttons. He could wear his school uniform. So it seems to be a successful way of handling a phobia involving disgust. So that's the 6-month follow-up. 12-month follow-up was the same thing. Give him the assessment tool, okay, the parent-child anxiety disorder interview schedule for the DSM-IV, and again, he is still capable of wearing a shirt with buttons. In the article, they address that the way to handle a phobia cognitively is through something called cognitive restructuring. And this is a term that you'll see a lot in A-level, especially for abnormal psychology involving things like depression. But it can be used for other irrational conditions where your thought processes are causing your irrational thoughts. Cognitive restructuring is a psychotherapeutic process of learning to identify and dispute irrational or maladaptive thoughts, known as cognitive distortions. An example that I use when teaching abnormal affect or depression is to take a statement that is faulty and to turn it into a better statement or a replacement thought. So taking poor thoughts and replacing them with better thoughts. It's almost like having thought surgery. The example I use here for depression is something like, I'm a failure. We could replace that with something like, I failed a quiz last week, which is a better way of looking at your situation. It is more specific, and it's not a forever condition. Unfortunately, we don't have many examples or any examples that I could find, maybe I'm wrong, in the original article that shows us what cognitive restructuring took place. All we know is that cognitive restructuring did take place. The article also provides us some graphs to show us how the stress increased after the in vivo and decreased after the exposure therapy. So there seems to be some evidence that the first try did not work, while the second try did work. But let me make these results easier. There's one place we could look to see how drastically his condition improved. When he was asked to imagine buttons falling on him, at the start of therapy, he rated such an incident as an 8 on the feelings thermometer. At the midpoint of the therapy sessions, that lowered down to a 5. And at the lowest point of these sessions, he was able to give it a 3. Now, this study, like I said earlier, doesn't provide a lot of detail. So why do we study it at AS level? I think part of the reason is that it primes us for some of the things we talk about at A level, namely behaviorism and cognitive behavioral therapies, which is a big part of several sections of the A-level syllabus. So this is a good primer. Let me jump real quick to the evaluation to conclude this study. Like a lot of case studies that deal with one or a few people, it's going to have low generalizability. Not just because it's one boy, but because his phobia, compunophobia, the fear of buttons, is extremely rare. You may know somebody who has it. However, there are more common phobias, things like claustrophobia, acrophobia, the fear of snakes, or the fear of tiny holes, which is something surprisingly a lot of people have. So this is probably the lowest of all the studies we've done in terms of generalizability. It's hard to talk about reliability and validity when this is not a lab or field experiment. We don't have to worry too much about controls because we know it's a case study. I guess the argument could be made that because there was a baseline for his feelings using a thermometer, that this study can be somewhat replicated and reproduced, and it could serve as a control for comparison later on. But maybe that's a stretch. Also, we are using standard measurement tools in determining his specific phobia with the DSM-IV. Application may not seem too high because, again, not a lot of people have this, but again, you could apply it to other types of phobias. So in short, it could lend support for choosing imaginal desensitization over in vivo therapies for phobias that involve the feeling of disgust. Also, it encourages other therapists not to ignore discuss when treating or theorizing about phobias. So we're opening a door for a new possibility of another emotion besides fear involved in phobias. Validity, well, in terms of ecological validity, it really took place in a real therapist's office. This is a real functioning part of our everyday lives. Therapy offices do exist. And it's also in depth. So case studies usually mean a lot of details, a lot of research, a lot of background. So in this case, it's quite valid that we are indeed studying a genuine phobia and that disgust is involved. Ethics are high. However, in order to treat something with in vivo, especially, we need to expose the person to the feared object. In some cases, this can cause a lot of stress and anxiety in the patient. So while we're trying to help him, in order to help, we do have to cause some discomfort. Okay, that is the end of the Saavedra and Silverman study in terms of this video, but please don't use it as a replacement for the secondary and primary sources you have available to you. Have a good day.